Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear participants. Welcome to today's session. Today we shall be talking about the moral message of the Quran. And as far as this moral message of the Quran is concerned, we have spoken on this topic on a number of occasions. But today, just as a reminder to all of us vis-a-vis this moral message, we will study certain text from the Quran, certain verses, a passage, in fact, from the Quran, which is a very good exemplar of this moral message. It actually gives an overview of this moral message. But before I begin, a couple of important things that need to be noted regarding the moral teachings of the Quran. So, first of all, the Quran itself tells us that as far as morals are concerned, as far as ethics are concerned, basic morality is concerned, uh, human beings don't need to go anywhere to find out what exactly this basic morality is. The premise of the Quran is that this basic morality is ingrained in our own selves. Out of our own initial experience as human beings, as we grow along in life, we get to know what this morality is. And such is the vast and you can say unfathomable and common nature of this sense that every human being feels for these morals the way any other human being could. Thus, for example, justice, sympathy, kindness, speaking the truth, avoiding deception, all these are universal truths or universal wrongs which have to be abstained from. And the premise of the Quran is that as far as these morals are concerned, the best judge of them is our own conscience. So the Quran tells us that our own conscience is enough to give a verdict regarding what is right and what is wrong. And in fact, the Quran has itself pointed out to this fact by saying, فَأَلْهَمَهَا فُجُورَهَا وَتَقْوَاهَا, which means that God has revealed to the soul what is right and what is wrong. In other words, our own inborn guidance, ingrained guidance is sufficient to tell us that as far as good and bad morals are concerned, we need not go anywhere. And our own conscience is the best judge of them. Prophet Muhammad ﷺ has also actually delineated this Quranic verse by saying, when someone asked him that what is sin, what is evil, and his reply was ma haka fi sadrik, which means that anything which has this compunction in your own chest, you feel bad about it, and there is a feeling of guilt in you. And the second thing that he said was وَكَرِهْتَ أَن يُطَّلَعَ عَلَيْهِ النَّاسِ, that you would not like to disclose it to other people. So obviously, when you are doing wrong things, you're doing something bad, you would like to hide them. So the first thing that we have to understand here, as that morals are concerned, this is a chapter in a life of a human being which does not need any external guidance. It is something that is ingrained in him. Now, if this is so, then the question arises that why have we come up with this topic that there is a moral message of the Quran? So if we understand this basic premise that we are inborn with this guidance, we will come to know that the role of the Quran in this regard is that it reminds us of this basic guidance that we tend to forget. So this morality which is ingrained in us, it is not that the Quran for the first time tells us that speaking the truth or being just or kind is a virtue. The thing it wants us to communicate is that we already know that these are truths. We already know that we have to act upon them. But as human beings, we tend to forget them. We tend to be oblivious of them. So what the Quran does is, when it speaks of these things, it actually reminds us of what we already know. And it also tells us that there are certain things in this human span that when we come across them, we tend to lose sight of these morals. Thus, for example, our own personal interest, our own carelessness, arrogance, and there are a number of other things that might be a block, that might create a block for this internal guidance. So at times that internal guidance needs to be shaken and jolted. It's like telling human beings that you already know this, but please be reminded. So when we talk about the moral message of the Quran, we have to understand that this moral message basically tells us that whatever we have in our own selves as human beings, it must conform to the highest standards of morality. And at the same time, we must acknowledge that as one of the greatest reminders of this message that we have, the Quran plays its role with great, I would say, with a lot of emphasis. So basically, you know that the Quran is also called zikra, or it is something which reminds us. So this reminding role of the Quran is something which we have to understand, that when we speak of the moral message of the Quran, it is not that we are implying that for the first time the Quran is telling us this is what morality is. It is telling us primarily that as far as morality is concerned, it is found in our own selves, and all that we need to do is just be able to understand when the Quran reminds us that yes, this is a message that I had forgotten, and from now I'll have this fresh in my mind. Now, the passage that I've selected for this, I can say this lost lesson is from Surah Bani Israel. These are the verses of the Quran which I can safely say they comprehensively deal with this message. They comprehensively state this message. There are several other instances in the Quran as well in which this moral message has been stated. And when I say moral message, of course, it's like a moral reminder. So this reminder for morality has been stated at a number of instances in the Quran. I have selected the passage from Surah Bani Israel because I think this is the most comprehensive passage which covers almost everything that we can think of regarding basic morality, and it gives us everyday guidance on that. So I'm just going to share my screen with you regarding this passage so that you can also see it being displayed, and I'll also try to explain this passage as we go along. So this is Surah Bani Israel. We start off with verses 22, and they read, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, La taj'al ma'allahi ilahan akhar wa fata'uda mazmuman makhzula. So the first thing which is said is, serve no other God but God, lest on the day of judgment you are left blameworthy and disgraceful. So you would see that the moral teachings of the Quran start off with the fact that we should not associate anyone with God. In other words, associating other people with God or other deities with God is like violating the morality that we have. So the contention of the Quran is that the conception of God is found in our own selves. And for someone to say that there are more than one God, the proof has to come from God himself, because of course if there are partners that we might be having, then the Almighty says at a number of instances in the Quran that it is I who have to inform you if I have partners, and if I have not informed you, then what you are doing is you're imputing partners with me, and this is a false imputation. It's a false ascription, and therefore the Quran calls it iftara Allah, which means imputing falsehood to God, ascribing something which he had never himself has condoned. So this is what the Quran tells us, that the biggest sin or the biggest moral sin that human beings can come across or can think of is polytheism or associating partners with God, because for this they don't have any grounds, they don't have any basis, they don't have any pretext. The Quran tells us on behalf of the Almighty continuously that had God had partners, he would have been the first to inform us. And if he has not informed us of these partners, how can we know, or how do we exactly adjudicate that he has partners? And if we do so, then we are crossing our limits and we are imputing a very grave lie on God. So the very first directive which is given in the form of a moral reproach is that don't associate partners with God, for it would happen that on the day of judgment you will be held blameworthy. You will have no excuse for this, and then you will be consigned to the gravest of punishments. So it starts off with this very strong note against polytheism. And then it says, وَقَضَىٰ رَبُّكَ أَلَّا تَعْبُدُوا إِلَّا إِيَّاهُ وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا. And remember that your Lord has enjoined you to worship none but him and to treat well your parents. So this is the second thing. I mean, this is something which is the positive statement of what has been stated negatively in the first verse. It says that do not associate partners with God, do not have deities being set up besides him. And as a natural consequence of this, it says that you have to worship one God. And your Lord has enjoined you to worship none but him. وَقَضَىٰ رَبُّكَ أَلَّا تَعْبُدُوا إِلَّا إِيَّاهُ. So it is the directive of God that you have to worship only Him, because He is the sole deity, He is the sole creator. And then it says, Wabil walidaini ihsana. If you have studied the Quran, and I'm sure you have, you'll find out that on almost on all occasions, whenever the right of the Almighty is stated like this, and the right here, of course, is that only He should be worshipped, then the very next thing which is brought up by the Quran is what a person should do with his parents. So the right of the parents are often mentioned right after the right of God, as you can see here as well. So wabil walidaini ihsana, you treat your parents with kindness. And it says, imma yablughanna indaka al-kibara ahaduhuma aw kilahuma fala taqul lahuma uffin wala tanharhuma wa qul lahuma qawlan karima. If either or both of them attain old age in your life before you, show them no sign of impatience, nor scold them while answering, but speak to them with good etiquette and treat them with humility and tenderness. So you see, this directive regarding parents goes on. And what we are told is that if one of the parents or both of them, they reach old age in front of us, which means that they are at that stage of their life, when at times what they do tends to irritate their children. They repeat things. They at times forget things. So all kinds of frailties they creep up in their lives. But what the children have been advised is "Fala taqul lahuma uffin," which means show no sign of impatience. Now, this word uffin must be reflected upon. It is an Arabic word meaning not to be impatient. I mean, when we say that we are impatient, the word which is used in the Quran is uffin. And this is contrary to its Urdu meaning, which means to be disobedient. So it's not in the meaning of disobedient in Arabic. In Arabic, the word uffin means to be impatient. So the first thing which the Quran states is "Fala taqul lahuma uffin," and don't be impatient to your parents, because they are going to repeat things, they are going to forget things, and they are going to simply act as if they are babies or very young ones. So you have to be patient with them. And the next thing which the Quran tells us is "Wala tanharhuma," do not scold them while answering. "Wa qul lahuma qawlan karima," but speak to them with etiquette. I mean, with a lot of softness, with good etiquette. So wala tanharhuma, which means, of course, that do not scold them. And I think that we would do good by reflecting on these words once again, because today, as the life goes on, we see children becoming impatient, children scolding their parents, children speaking to them very harshly, very rudely, in a way that is absolutely unbecoming. But this goes on, and it is the parents who bear the brunt of this misguided attitude from their children. But the Quran tells us that yes, when they reach old age, they do become cranky, they do become irritable, they do things that you might not, they might not sit well with you. But then you must realize that you were also someone who was thrown in their lap, and they cared about you. And so you have to return the favor. In fact, you just cannot return the favor, but what you can do is at least not scold them. And then the words are, وَقُلْ لَهُمَا قَوْلًا كَرِيمًا. Speak to them with gentle tone, in a gentle tone, in a soft voice, with good etiquette. And then it says, وَخْفِزْ لَهُمَا جَنَاحَ الذُّلِّ مِنَ الرَّحْمَةِ. وَخْفِزْ لَهُمَا جَنَاحَ الذُّلِّ مِنَ الرَّحْمَةِ وَقُلْ رَبِّ ارْحَمْهُمَا كَمَا رَبَّيَانِي صَغِيرًا. So treat them with humility and tenderness and say, Lord, be merciful to them the way they nursed me in childhood. So this is exactly what I was just speaking of just earlier, that you have to be humble and kind and tender with them and speak to them in a very soft tone. And in fact, the prayer that has been taught to us, and which most of us might remember, is Rabbi irhamhuma kama rabbayani saghira, that Lord, be merciful to them the way they nursed me in childhood. So just as they were merciful to me, just as they were tender to me in childhood, O Lord Almighty, have mercy on them now that they have grown old in age and they need your mercy. And then it says, Rabbukum a'lamu bima fi nufusikum. Your Lord fully knows what is in your hearts. If you remain obedient to them, then you should know that He forgives those who turn to Him. So The words of the Quran are Rabbukum a'lamu bima fi nufusikum in takunu salihina fa innahu kana lil awwabina ghafura. So your Lord knows what is in your hearts. If you remain obedient to them, then you should know that He forgives them and who turn to them. Which means that at times there are blemishes that might take place. At times we become rude. At times we do become impatient and talk harshly with our parents. But the Almighty tells us that, well, if there is a blemish, then you seek forgiveness from the Almighty because He is forgiving. And He knows what is in your hearts. You didn't want to be rude to your parents, but somehow these harsh words came out of your mouth. So apologize for them and become the biggest well-wisher of your parents. So if you do so, then any blemishes, any mistakes that you might have made will be forgiven by the Almighty. Next, the Quran actually takes up some of the other relations that we as human beings have. So it speaks of وَآتِ ذَا الْقُرْبَى حَقَّهُ وَالْمِسْكِينَ وَابْنَ السَّبِيلَ وَلَا تُبَذِّرْ تَبْذِيرًا, which means, and give to the near of kin their due, and also the destitute, and to the traveler, and do not squander your wealth wastefully. So the things that this verse points out, first it says وَآتِ ذَا الْقُرْبَى حَقَّهُ, which means that you give the kin, your blood relatives, people who are close to you, you give them their due, which means be kind to them, be affectionate to them. If they need your company, if they need your affection, if they need your money, if they need anything, then always be there to provide these things to them, because this is their right. Look what the Quran has said. It says, وَآتِ ذَا الْقُرْبَى حَقَّهُ. You provide whatever their right is. And of course, when they are in a position that they would need help from all of us, then the Quran tells us that you must not desist. And then it goes on to say, well, miskina, people who are the destitute, people who are poor, don't refrain from spending on them. Do what best you can. And also to the traveler. Now, you might be a little amazed at why the travelers are mentioned here, because of course traveling is something which why would the Quran point out that travelers have to be spent upon? So in the olden times, traveling was a huge affair. It was like a hassle that people would follow and had to follow, and they would at times become dependent on the society, especially when they would go to a new place. There were no hotels, or there were no rest houses or guest houses. People would mostly travel to new cities, and they would become dependent on people who would be living there for their livelihood also, and at times for food as well. So the Quran treats them in a way, it tells them that you have to be kind to your travelers, people who have traveled from one city to another. They have arrived in your city, they need your affection, they need some shelter, they might need some clothing or food. So do the due. And then one important thing is said, وَلَا تُبَذِّرْ تَبْذِيرًا, that do not squander your wealth wastefully. So being wasteful, being spending or overspending and keeping on spending is something which the Quran has stopped us from. It tells us that if you keep on spending, you are going to just squander your wealth. And why does it say so right after mentioning the right of our relatives and the destitute and the traveler? Because when there is the time that you would like to be of help to these people, it should not be the case that you don't have any money because you just squandered it. So not only is this squandering something that might leave the person himself to be wanting, but at the same time, the help that he could have provided to the weaker sections of the society, the chance that he could have for that would have gone a begging, but would have been lost. Because you see, you would not have the money because you've squandered the money, you've wasted it away. Whatever you could have saved for other people, you never had the inclination to do so. And as a result, you were left with your own expenses, and at times even those would not be fulfilled. So وَلَا تُبَذِّرْ تَبْذِيرًا. And then it says that as far as this thing is concerned, you have to understand that this is what Satan does. إِنَّ الْمُبَذِّرِينَ كَانُوا إِخْوَانَ الشَّيَاطِينَ, which means that if you do so, then you have to understand that this is what Satan does. Or people who are devils, they do. They keep on spending money, and they would not think that this money has, we have a right for other people as far as his money is concerned. So the words are innal mubazzirina kanu ikhwana shayateen. So people who are wasteful, they are Satan's brothers. So this shows that how bad a thing is, that when we start spending and we start overspending, the Almighty says that such is this evil that we are regarded to be brothers of Satan. And then it says, "Vakana shaytanu li rabbihi kafura." And Satan is ever ungrateful to his Lord. So remember, he was an ungrateful. He would not spend on other people. He would deny the rights of other people. He would not allow people to spend on other people. This is how he would distract them. He would tell them that if you spend on other people, you will be left with nothing for your own selves. You would become poor and therefore should not spend on others. Instead, you just spend on your own self. And if you do so, just do so in a manner that you just waste that money. This is what Satan tells us. And the Almighty says, no, this should not be the case, that you must not overspend. And then it says, وَإِمَّا تُعْرِضَنَّ عَنْهُ ابْتِغَاءَ رَحْمَةٍ مِّن رَبِّكَ تَرْجُوهَا فَقُلْ لَهُمَا قَوْلًا مَيْسُورًا. And if you have to disregard those in need because you are seeking your Lord's bounty of which you are waiting, then speak to them affectionately. So you see, here the Quran tells us that there could be instances in which you are not able to help other people because you yourself are in want, you yourself are in need. So if you're not able to give other people what they need, so at least speak to them with kindness. Do not scold them back. Do not harass them in any way. Just present your own excuse that at the moment you are not able to help them out. And the Quran tells us, فَقُلْ لَهُمَا قَوْلًا مَيْسُورًا. Then speak to them in a very, very humble tone, in a very affectionate tone. Tell them that, yes, at the moment I am not in a position to help you. And whenever I will, inshallah, I'll do so. But don't be harsh on them, don't scold them. And the verse goes on, these verses go on to tell a further etiquette regarding spending. It tells us that وَلَا تَجْعَلْ يَدَكَ مَغْلُولَةً عَلَىٰ عُنُقِكَ وَلَا تَبْسُطْهَا كُلَّ الْبَسْطِ فَتَقْعُدَ مَلُومًا مَحْسُورًا. So, and do not be miserly or prodigal, that as a result of it you should either earn reproach or be reduced to indigence. So you should not be stingy, or you should not be totally overspending, and you should not be in such a position that you don't have any money left after that overspending. So neither be stingy nor be overly spending. In fact, what the Quran tells us is that if you do so, you would either earn reproach or be reduced to indigence, because of course in this case, when you are left with nothing, you will not be able to help other people with anything, and you'll earn their reproach. And at the same time, if you start spending and spending without any limitation and without any restriction, then you might yourself end up in indigence. You will be reduced to poverty. So this is what the Quran tells us, that don't be stingy, don't be a person who is like not spending, and neither you should be overspending. And then the Quran tells us, Inna rabbaka yabsutu rizqa liman yasha'u wa yaqdir. Indeed, your Lord gives abundantly to whom he pleases and sparingly to whom he pleases. So this is the law of God, that as far as livelihood is concerned, as far as sustenance is concerned, this is something which God himself has planned for human beings. To some he gives in abundance, to others he gives in constriction. He takes away things from them. And this is done on the basis of God's wisdom, because this world is created as a trial and test. And the means of trying and testing people is that some of them are given a lot of wealth so that it could become a test of their gratitude. And others are deprived of wealth so that this could become a test of their patience. So we are faced with two important trials in this world all the time. Either it's a trial of patience on being deprived of something, or a trial of gratitude on being given something, on being blessed with his favors. So in both cases, the Almighty says, Inna rabbaka yabsutu rizqa liman yasha'u wa yaqdir. He pleases, he would give abundantly and he would give sparingly to whom he pleases, which means that he does so as per his law, which of course is based on his wisdom. And then it says, Innahu kana bi'ibadihi khabiran basira. He is aware of his servants and is observing them. So no one should think that he is beyond the grasp of God, beyond the sight of God. The Almighty knows wherever a person is. He knows his intentions. He knows whatever people are thinking and doing, and he's observing them. And then we have another set of directives just following what we have just discussed regarding spending. And the Quran says, وَلَا تَقْتُلُوا أَوْلَادَكُمْ خَشْيَةَ إِمْلَاقٍ. So it says, and do not kill your children for fear of poverty. Now, of course, one cannot even think of this heinous crime of slaughtering one's children or killing them for fear of poverty. But yes, you'll find out as you study history that this was something of a norm in the Arabian society, that they would kill their girls, especially their female child or children, because they would think that they are no use to them and they would grow up. And we have them burying them alive at times, as the Quran has pointed out elsewhere. And this would be something that they would do. And mind you that this is not just in Arabia. We have other societies as well in which people would just kill their children because of poverty. But look what the Almighty has said. He says, "Nahnu narzuquhum wa iyyakum." So what you are doing is that you're killing your children because of the fear of poverty, but you don't realize, Almighty says, I am the one, or we are the ones who provide rizq to you. We provide sustenance to you and to your children as well. So who are you to kill them for fear of poverty? Because this is something which is the job of God. It is his task to provide sustenance and livelihood to people. And the Quran actually, it reprimands people who does so. And by saying that, well, if you think that you are killing someone with poverty, remember it is God who is providing you as well as their children. So you must not be oblivious to this fact that as far as rizq is concerned, as far as sustenance is concerned, this is something which is the domain of God. And then it ends by saying, "Inna qatlahum kana khit'an kabira," because killing them is a heinous crime. If you do so, you are doing something which is absolutely uncalled for. It has no basis. You are killing a human being who is defenseless, someone who was just born to you and given to you and thrown into your lap. And look what you have done, that you have just made him vanish from this world because of your own petty thinking that you might not be able to provide him with any food or sustenance. And then the Quran goes on to say, "Wala taqrabu zina," of course, which means that do not even go near adultery. "Innahu kana fahishatan, innahu kana fahishatan wa sa'a sabila," because it is blatant lewdness and a very evil path. So the first thing that it says regarding adultery is don't even go near it. What does this mean? It means that things that might lead a person to adultery, they should be avoided as well. Thus, for example, looking at things or observing things or listening to things or watching things that might induce a person to adultery, you should abstain from that. And elsewhere, we find the Quran telling us that the key to this is that you have to restrain your eyes. So, ghazzul basar, which means that you have to restrain your eyes from taking undue liberty, is what the Quran is telling us here. And when it says that don't even go near adultery, so it doesn't say that do not commit adultery. It says don't even go near adultery, which means that things that might lead people to adultery should be avoided. And we know from other parts of the Quran that the reference is that you have to restrain your eyes, because the eyes are the first instance through which a person is induced towards a heinous crime. So this is what the Quran says, and then it says, "Innahu kana fahisha wa sa'a sabila." It's blatant lewdness and a very evil path, and you have to avoid that. So the verses continue with the moral message, and they say, "Wala taqtulu an-nafs allati harrama Allahu illa bil haqq, wa man qutila mazluman faqad ja'alna li waliyyi sultana fala yusrif fil qatl innahu kana mansura." And do not wrongfully kill any person whose life has been held sacred by God. And remember that if someone is slain unjustly, we have given his heir the authority. Then he should not also exceed limits in his revenge, because he has been helped. So this is the Quranic law of qisas, which has also been mentioned elsewhere, that if someone has been killed, then yes, in lieu of that killing, you can kill that person, unless, of course, the heirs, they are in a position to forgive the person who has killed them. And we know that Surah Bani Israel is a Meccan surah in which the state had not been established. And in those times, in the absence of any state, this was left to a person or between two persons so that this revenge could be taken. But later on, when the state of Medina, when the state had been established, the law of Qisas was given in its formal shape, and it meant that you have to be very just in that case, and only if the heirs of the victim and the state itself forgives the person who has killed the person or the victim, that he can be forgiven. But then the Quran tells us here that if you exceed the limits by exacting more revenge, then this is another thing that must not be done, because this would be an unjust thing. So it says that if you do this, then you'll be doing a great wrong. The next thing which has been mentioned in this verse or these verses is the right of orphans, and it says, وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا مَالَ الْيَتِيمِ إِلَّا بِالَّتِي هِيَ أَحْسَنُ حَتَّى يَبْلُغَ أَشُدَّهُ. So which of course tells us that do not approach the wealth of orphans except in a just manner until they reach maturity. Which of course means that at times there are orphans which are in our custody, and because we are custodians of these orphans, we can spend from their wealth for their own betterment, for their own benefit. But it should not be the case that you use this wealth in an ill way and start spending on our own selves, especially when we are the custodians of the wealth of the orphans. Then we must be extremely cautious in this. And as soon as they reach maturity, it is that the Quran tells us that you should give that money back to them. You should tell them that you are the custodians of the money or the wealth that they possess, that now that they have grown old, it is being returned to you. But during this period of trust, you should not in any way violate this trust and start spending that money on your own selves. So next thing which these verses mention is وَأَوْفُوا بِالْأَحْدِ إِنَّ الْأَحْدَ كَانَ مَسْئُولًا, and keep your promises, because you shall be held accountable for promises. Of course, this we all know that as far as giving our word is concerned, as far as making a commitment is concerned, this is something that we have to abide by in all circumstances. The Quran tells us that you should not go back on your words, because you will be questioned for this. Inna al-ahda kana mas'ula. Whatever you do, you will be held accountable for that. And all of us need to once again reevaluate our lives, that there are so many instances in which we give our word, in which we make promises to other people, and right at the time that we might be making a promise, we know that we would not be able to fulfill it, but still we make that promise. And this is, of course, a very sorry state of affairs. We have to understand that promises must always be kept. And in fact, a wider connotation with this is that our religion is a promise that we have made with God to abide by. So that is why the Quran also calls this religion as Misaq. Misaq means an agreement. So it's like an agreement that we have made with God, and we have to abide by that agreement by following our religion in letter and spirit. The next thing which these verses mention, وَأَوْفُوا الْكَيْلَ إِذَا كِلْتُمْ وَزِنُوا بِالْقِسْطَاسِ الْمُسْتَقِيمِ ذَلِكَ خَيْرٌ وَأَحْسَنُ تَأْوِيلًا. And it says that give full measure when you measure, and weigh with correct scales. This is better and fair as far as the consequences are concerned. So very, very sound advice which is given to people who spend their livelihood in the markets, who weigh and who, of course, measure for people, that you must not be dishonest in any way in measuring and weighing. And in this case, the Quran tells us that if you do this in the right way, it is better and fair as far as the consequences are concerned, which means that, of course, God will reward these people for their honesty. So you have to be honest in weighing and in measuring. And as people who we frequent in the markets, we go there and we buy a lot of things, groceries and things that have to be measured, they have to be weighed. It is a very, very important advice which the Quran is given, because one can easily defraud the people who are customers by weighing or by measuring in a slightly less way. And the Quran does not condone this attitude in any way. And then the verses go on to say, وَلَا تَقْفُ مَا لَيْسَ لَكَ بِهِ عِلْمٍ, and do not go after what you know not. And then the Quran actually says, إِنَّ السَّمْعَ وَالْبَصَرَ وَالْفُؤَادَ كُلُّ أُولَٰئِكَ كَانَ عَنْهُ مَسْئُولًا. Because you have to know that your eyes and ears and heart, all of them shall be held accountable. So what you don't know, do not speak about it. Don't go after things that you have no knowledge of, because when we speak of things that we have no knowledge of, or we start pursuing things that we cannot know, or we are not in a position to know, then we have to realize that these are our limits. We have to stay within our limits. Things that which are not in our knowledge, if we start expressing our own opinion about those things, it would be as if we are lying. Actually, we are giving false statements because we don't have any knowledge of those things. So, وَلَا تَقْفُ مَا لَيْسَ لَكَ بِهِ عِلْمٍ. Do not go after what you know not. And why? Because eyes and ears and heart, all of these shall be held accountable. Because this is how we do so. It is through our eyes and through our ears and through our heart that we go after other things. So the Quran tells us, كُلُّ أُولَٰئِكَ كَانَ عَنْهُ مَسْئُولًا. And then these verses say, وَلَا تَمْشِي فِي الْأَرْضِ مَرَحًا إِنَّكَ لَن تَخْرِقَ الْأَرْضَ وَلَن تَبْلُغَ الْجِبَالَ طُولًا. A very important advice. And do not walk conceitedly on the earth, because neither can you split the earth nor can you rival the mountains in stature. So you see, arrogance, haughtiness, to think big of oneself, to be full of oneself, is something which the Quran tells us that we have to avoid. And the foremost thing which comes to mind when we look at people who are arrogant, when we look at people who are haughty, is the way that they walk. It's the gait that is noticeable. So they don't walk as humble servants of God. At another place in the Quran, we know what is said is that Ibadur Rahman allazina yamshuna fil ardi hauna, that the servants of the most merciful are those who walk on this earth with humility, and they are absolutely down to earth. They realize that they are human beings, and they don't show arrogance. So it is exactly here what the Quran tells us, La tamshi fil ardi maraha, do not walk conceitedly on the earth, because neither can you split the earth, nor can you rival the mountain stature. Because if you're walking in such a manner, it gives the impression as if the earth is going to split asunder beneath your feet, and as if you are so tall that even these mountains are shorter to you in stature. This is what a person feels internally. So this is like a symbolic thing which the Quran tells us, that when we walk, we feel as if there's nothing below us, the earth is going to be rent asunder. And when we walk in a way in which we have this flavor of glamour in our own selves, or become arrogant, we also think that we are as tall as mountains. So the Quran tells us that you cannot rival the mountains, however much you might think of that. So arrogance and haughtiness, pride and vanity, these are some of the evils that do catch us unaware. And the Quran actually has pointed out in a number of places that do not be proud, do not show vanity. And as the age-old adage goes, that pride hath a fall. So people who are proud, people who are arrogant, they'll one day realize that look how far below they fell from the top, and now they don't realize that this is how God has treated them. So we have to be humble servants of God. We have to realize that as human beings, we have our own faults, we have our own shortcomings. And the best antidote to arrogance, the best antidote to haughtiness, is that we keep an eye on our own faults. If we keep an eye on our own faults, we'll realize that we are people who are plagued with these faults, and arrogance will never creep in us in this way. And again, the Quran tells us that as far as these directives are concerned, kullu zalika kana sayyi'uhu inda rabbika makruha. It says that you have to understand that these are the evils that have been. This is something of an evil that which is in the eyes of God absolutely abhorrent. And I can see that this part of the verse has perhaps been left out in the translation, and I think we need to furnish that, because I think while cutting pasting, this part of the translation has gone missing. So kullu zalika kana sayyi'uhu, which means that all this what has been mentioned earlier, these evils that have been mentioned earlier, they are things that are evil, and in the rabbika makruha, and they are things which are abhorrent before God. And then these verses end off by this beautiful last verse, zalika mimma awha ilayka rabbuka min al-hikmah. This is the wisdom which your Lord has revealed to you. Hold on steadfastly to it. And then you might remember that we started off these directives with the mention of the fact that we must not associate partners with God. And look and behold that at the very end, while these directives are ending, the same directive is repeated. And this often takes place in the Quran in order to point out the importance of a certain thing. So the Quran would begin with a certain directive and end on the same directive, signifying the fact that how important that directive is. So it started off by telling us that do not associate partners with God. And you look right at the end, the same verse is repeated, although the words are different. It says, وَلَا تَجْعَلْ مَعَ اللَّهِ إِلَهًا آخَرَ فَتُلْقَى فِي جَهَنَّمَ مَلُومًا مَدْحُورًا. So serve no other deity besides God, lest as a result you should be cast into hell, condemned and rejected. So once again, polytheism is brought up as a subject, and polytheism was the subject. I can just show you once again how we just started off with that. Look at this verse with which we started off. La taj'al ma'allahi ilahan akhar. Do not associate partners with God. Serve no God except God. And then look at the ending verse. It's exactly the same. La taj'al ma'allahi ilahan akhar. Do not set up other deities beside God. فَتُلْقَى فِي جَهَنَّمَ مَلُومًا مَدْحُورًا. Otherwise you shall be cast into hell, condemned and rejected. So, my dear listeners, this was a very comprehensive passage from the Quran, which tells us that how, as far as the Quranic moral message is concerned, it is so important that we keep on studying the Quran, revising the Quran, and also understanding the fact that this moral message is something of a reminder, and we as human beings tend to forget these things. So the Quran keeps on reminding us, and we would do good if we keep these things in mind. So I would end my talk here, and if you have any questions, I'm available for them. Thank you very much.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Shehzad, for a very enlightening talk. We all need this reminder on a regular basis about the moral teachings of the Quran. With that, we have got some questions. So the first question is from Annie Onaiza. Annie, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you again for the talk. This was really very helpful. And my question is a bit more general, Dr. Saab. So, typically when we look at our modern sensibilities, morality is anchored on the dignity of human existence, right? And the Meccan society where the Quran was revealed was a tribal Arab society. So I think, you could imagine that the concept of morality may have been different in different types of habitats and different types of cultures, even though the basic principle of right and wrong, as you said, is programmed inside of us, as the Quran says. But today, when we look at human rights, the anchor point is really human freedom and human dignity. So we say slavery is wrong, concubinage is wrong, spousal assault is wrong, and so on and so forth. But when one reads the Quran, one finds sanction for these practices. So my question to you is, how should we look at the moral message of the Quran? Should we contextualize it? Should we think in terms of progressive change? Should we go beyond the text to principles that are more in line with human sensibilities now? So, is it rules or is it principles? How do you think about that?
So I think we need to understand that there is a basic division. So one thing is the rules and regulations that you just pointed out, which we call as the Sharia. And another thing is the moral sensibility or the moral sensitivity, which relates to right and wrong vis-a-vis universal truths. So when I talk about morality and I speak about morality, I'm not talking about specific directives of the Sharia, which you refer to like concubinage or spousal bashing, as we might call it. I can explain those aspects to you, but they belong to the category that we call the Sharia or the law. So today the talk was relating to universal human morals, I would say. So morality, which is shared by every single human being. That's, for example, arrogance, or for example, the fact that you are disobedient to your parents, to the fact that you're harsh to your parents, you treat them rudely in a way That is absolutely unbecoming. So the things that the Quran has pointed out here, they are shared heritage of all humanity, I would say. But the ones that you are referring to, as I said, they are specific subjects, which of course are just, I mean, they are very sensitive subjects. But because I have spoken on them on a number of occasions, I think if you could, if some of our admins will guide you towards the answers to these questions, you might feel satisfied by listening to them, or you can have further questions. But just to make this distinction, that as far as directives are concerned, they have to be dealt with separately. And when I talk about moral message, I am referring to what is shared by all human beings. And I think if you look at the list that we have just gone through today, you might agree with the fact that whatever is mentioned here is something regarding which no one would say that we should not do this, or we should not do that, or we should not adopt this. I mean, all these things are shared values amongst humanity. And I was just talking about these shared values, and also, as you said, I had referred to the fact that these shared values are something that we are programmed already. When you already programmed about them, and all that the Quran does is it reminds us in its sublime style, and that style has, of course, a very potent effect on us, so that we can leave these things or adopt certain things.
Thank you. Up next is Danish. Danish, can you unmute and ask your question?
Okay, so my question came across, so I was reading listening to lectures of the Tadabbur Quran on Surah Al Imran, and in there was a hadith mentioned that, I can't copy paste it here, but essentially about Surah Al Imran and Al Baqarah providing shade for those who love these surahs on the Day of Judgment. The context of the tafsir was different. It was just trying to make a point that they're connected surahs, they're sibling surahs. But I was interested not so much in the detail of this hadith, but more sort of in the setup on the Day of Judgment of the ground of measure. So you have people of the right hand, left hand, and the foremost, and then you have the throne of God that provides shade to a subset of people. So in that context, I was trying to understand where this fits in. So just if you can comment on whether this hadith is reliable or not, and sort of like who is it addressing?
Are you referring to the fact that these two surahs would appear as clouds and give shelter and shade? So this is basically a symbol. This is an absolutely correct hadith. There's nothing wrong with it. It's basically symbolically telling us that the importance of these two surahs, that if people understand them, they understand the message, they will not go astray. Because if you read these two surahs, you'll find out that they actually refer to the follies of the people of the book before us, or before Muslims. So the follies which were committed by the Jews and the Christians, they have been described in detail in Surah Baqarah and Surah Al Imran. So when people are able to not repeat those follies, and they are on guard against them, then it will be as if these two surahs have protected them from going astray. So it's like a symbolic statement which is presented here.
Thank you.
Rafia Khwaja, please go ahead.
Dr. Shehzad, I heard many Muslims say that only Muslims will go to heaven and non-Muslims will not go to heaven. Could you please comment on Surah Baqarah, Ayat 62, and put some light on this? Because that ayat, to me, it appears like it is different from what many Muslims have been saying. So if you could guide me, please. Thank you.
I think you've asked this question quite a number of times, and it seems that I have not been convincing enough, because this particular verse of Surah Baqarah has been under discussion a lot of times. I'll try once again, and that is that the Quran here tells us specifically that as far as people are concerned, it names all those contesting groups which were present at that time in the land of Arabia. It says, "Inna lazina amanu," which means the Muslims, "wal lazina hadu," the Jews, "wal nasara," the Nazarenes or the Christians. And on some other occasions, some of the other groups are also mentioned, like the Majus or the Sabis. They were also lesser known groups or religions which were found in Arabia. The Quran tells us that as far as all these people are concerned, in fact, the context is that merely being a Muslim is not going to lead you to to paradise. As far as paradise is concerned, whether a person is a Muslim or a Christian or a Jew or a Sabi or a Magian, if they believe in one God, if they believe in the hereafter, if they do noble deeds, then the Quran says that paradise for them has been prescribed by the Almighty, which of course means that all types of people who subscribe to these standards will end up in paradise. And a corollary of this is that they should not be guilty of denying any major truth intentionally. So, of course, if the news of the fact that the Prophet of God was there and he delivered this final message has reached people and they have examined it, and then, of course, they are not convinced that whether the Prophet was true prophet or not, that's another thing. But they have to give a very strong thought to this, that as far as the person who's presenting this message is concerned, whether he is someone to be acknowledged or not. So, it's like an underpinning in these verses that the Risala or the prophethood of Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam is also something that you must have a reason to deny. Otherwise, it's part of this package as well. But then it tells us that people who belong to any of these groups, they are entitled to paradise. Right? So I think that we have to understand that claiming that paradise is only for Muslims and hell is a place for all non-Muslims or all non-believers. This is a concept that has arisen because of misunderstanding certain ahadiths or narratives of the Prophet. But as far as the Quran is concerned, it does not at all condone this picture.
Dr. Shehzad, thank you so much. I know I've asked several times, but I always get into an argument and I forget some part of what you said. So it's thank you for repeating it so I can be a little more convincing.
Right. Also, that I think another humble advice that I would give you is that you pick and choose your audience in which for which you have to discuss these things, because you see, not all people are geared towards discussion, because they don't base their arguments on their views on arguments and reasoning. On the contrary, they base their views on emotions. So I think it is best to pick and choose with whom you'd like to have an argument or a discussion. And if people are prone to emotions, it is best to discuss the weather with them or other things. Religion should only be discussed with those who are willing to have a discussion on the basis of reasoning, and they have an open mind, so that things which are not generally acceptable, if they come up, then at least they'll give an ear to them and not outrightly reject them.
बहुत आपका शुक्रिया. I totally understand. I am going to do that. Thank you. I'm really grateful. Thank you.
Up next is Noman Khan. Noman, please go ahead.
सर मेरा क्वेश्चन है, व्हाट इज द होली स्पिरिट इन इस्लाम? मतलब होली स्पिरिट का इस्लाम में क्या मतलब है?
You're talking about Ruhul Qudus, or you're talking about Ruhul Amin? So I mean,
Ruhul Amin.
So Ruhul Amin is Gabriel, is Jibrail. This is what the Quran has told us on a number of occasions, that Tanazzalul malaikatu wa ruhu fiha bi'izni rabbihim min kulli amr. So a ruh, whenever it is mentioned, or Ruhul Amin whenever it is mentioned, it is a title of the angel Gabriel. Gabriel, who brings down revelations, who brought down revelations to Prophet Muhammad. So whenever this word is mentioned, Nazala bihi Ruhul Amin, for example, it is said that the Quran was revealed to the Prophet through Ruhul Amin, which of course signifies Gabriel. So Jibrail or Gabriel is meant by this word.
Thank you. Ruhi, please unmute your mic and ask your question.
Sir, my question is about all these directives which you have just explained so nicely. On our personal level, of course, we can adopt all these directives and try to become nice people and nice human beings, nice Muslims, and try to go to heavens. But in today's broader national and international perspective, I feel extremely helpless, because what we see, the havoc being played with our country these days by various internal Muslim forces and external Muslim and non-Muslim forces, we feel so helpless. And perhaps we need to approach all these directives more on a much more political level and as a political force, joint political force, as perhaps guided by Dr. Ahmed in his lectures. I've been studying a little bit about his explanations, and I like his point of view that the Muslims should not only on a personal level they should become good Muslims, but they should assert themselves and rise on a more political scale. And this message should not only be spread among Muslims and non-Muslims, but it should be spread on the political level. Only then we can, of course, spread it on a wider level, as God perhaps has given us this, assigned us this duty to do in this world.
I think this is precisely what is called, I mean, a wider title to this activism is called the political Islam, or Islam as it addresses the society. And if you study the Quran in detail, you'll find that there is no, I mean, this activism is could be done on the part of a person if he has this personal inspiration or inclination towards it, but at no place in the Quran has it been regarded as a duty or a religious obligation. The obligation of people more so is to concentrate on their own selves, to become better people on their own personal selves, instead of thinking of what others are doing. On a larger scale, they have to think that what they themselves are doing. So, as they say, charity begins at home. In a similar way, if we have to change society, then that change has to be something that begins with our own selves. So the Quran is not as much interested in changing the society as much as it lays stress that we have to change ourselves, because God has going to be, I mean, He's going to hold us accountable for what we have done for our own selves, and not for what we did for the society as an obligation, I'm saying. And this doesn't mean that we should not do something in the collective sense. Yes, people who are able to influence other people and do collective work, or even influence political leaders, like making think tanks or opinion makers who come forward and do these things. These are all things that, of course, are good, and they can influence our society in a positive way. But what I'm just saying is that this is not a religious obligation, as has been regarded by many political activists, which started off by Ustaz Abul Ala Maududi, and Ustaz Dr. Ahmed also followed suit, because to him this political change does not come from a personal motivation. He says that this is like a farz, it's like a mandatory obligation. In fact, he calls it as farzul ain, which means obligation imposed on every person.
A number of things from Quran. He cites them from Quran, which I don't
so
remember.
I know that, and he has cited a number of verses. And I think if you would read the critique that has been presented from our side, and from particularly Ustaz Wahiduddin Khan, if you read his book, you'll see that how some of the verses which he has cited, and I'm talking about Maududi Sahab especially, because Dr. Isar is basically, I mean, started off with as a staunch follower of Maududi Sahab, and then he just differed with him regarding the modus operandi. He just said that, well, instead of bringing a change through elections, you have to bring this about through an Islamic revolution. So he just differed in the strategy. Otherwise, his thought is almost similar to that of Ustaz Abul Ala Maududi. And Ustaz Maududi's thought regarding political activism and political Islam has been critically evaluated by Ustaz Wahiduddin Khan and by our own teacher, Ustaz Javed Ghamidi. So you can see how they have seen, I mean, here they have evaluated how some of the verses which Maududi Sahab and Israr Sahab use for bringing about an Islamic revolution or a change in a society. And they say that this is an obligation for every single human being. They have been actually critically shown to be not the case. So I would suggest that you do read through those critiques as well. And as far as my own understanding is concerned, I also think that basically the Quran addresses the human beings. And when a person changes himself in the capacity that he is in, if I'm a common man, I'm going to change myself as per a common man. If I am a person who is at the helm of affairs, if I'm, for example, the ruler of an Islamic country or someone who's in charge, then my change will encompass the collectivity as well. So I'll not only change myself, but also I will be implementing some of the directives of religion which relate to the collectivity. So the capacities of human beings change when they are individuals. they adopt those individual directives. Then when they become collective responsibility for the collective affairs, like for example, when they become in charge of the society that they are part of, then the Quran addresses them as well and tells them to change accordingly. So basically, the Quran addresses the individual and tells that individual that wherever you are, if you are a common man, you do your work as a common man. If you're a person who is at the helm of affairs of a state, you do that particular tasks at that level. So this is how in my own humble understanding, I think this is how the Quran tells us to bring about a change. So it's not an obligation. It's not a mandatory farz, as these two scholars have pointed out.
Okay, it means that a common person should wait patiently for the good
Not
times.
only wait patiently, but do what best he can. I mean, he can do a lot of things. He can change. For starters, he could change himself or herself. He has a family to look after. He has colleagues. He has friends. He has a surrounding. So in his own surroundings, he can do a lot of things. And starting off with his own self. So you just cannot ask a person. You cannot task a person with the same job or the same obligation if he has different responsibilities and he has different abilities. So the Quran has actually classified that the responsibility of preaching of the prophets is different from the preaching of a ruler, from the preaching of a common man, and from the preaching of the progeny of Abraham. So basically, it's like saying that this preaching or this spreading the truth, it depends on the capacity that you are in. If you're a common man, your responsibility is what is described by Surah Asr, that you have to do tawasi bil haq and tawasi bil sabr, which means that you have to convey what is righteousness at your own personal level to other people. But if you're a scholar of religion, then your ambit, then your sphere increases, and then you have to go towards people and reform them. Similarly, if you are a ruler of an Islamic state, your preaching is entirely different. You have the whole state in which you can implement religion or implement the collective directives. And if you're part of Abraham's progeny, then for them, God's scheme is that they have to adhere to a collective system, as a result of which the Almighty will give them the leadership of the nations of the world. So it depends on your own capacity that you need to actually realize.
So we don't need to fall with the uprising sort of a thing that might be working right now.
Yes, as I said, this is something which these two scholars have pointed out, especially Dr. Shehzad. Otherwise, as far as the Quran is concerned, it says that you have to start off with your own self and then realize what capacity are you in. If you're a common man, then you have to just spread your own fragrance, so to speak, amongst people that you come into contact with through your own character.
Thank you, Dr. Shehzad, for a very detailed answer. I would request Naushad Shafqat, please go ahead and ask your question. Then we'll start the second round.
Thank you. Dr. I'm coming back to Surah 62 of Ayat 62 of Surah Baqarah. If there is a person, because the messengers and the angels have to be believed in, because the angels communicated the message from God to the prophets, and the prophets communicated it to the people. While the good, as you started off today's lecture by saying, is already imbued in us from birth. Now, if a person believes in God, believes in the last day, and does good deeds, without believing or disbelieving in the prophets, what would his status be? Is it like Muhammad Asad Saab in his translation says that 62 it shows the breadth of our religion? And would that be that only those who believe in the prophets also? Would they be amongst those mentioned in 62? Or just as 62 only mentions the Jews, the Nazarenes and the Sabians, would they, if they believe in the last day and do good deeds, what would their position be?
So their position would be that they have to realize that these three standards were brought to them by the Quran, and the Quran was something that was revealed to a prophet. I mean, so I mean, if they are conforming to these standards, they are following these standards, then they should ask this question, that where have these standards come from? So the answer they'll get is that they have come from a book which was revealed to a prophet. And therefore, implicitly, it is understood that for them, they have to believe in the prophet, and only negatively will they be entertained if they have a legitimate excuse, for example, that they were somehow not, they could not fully receive the teachings of the prophet, or they were not, they could, I mean, if they received them, they were not fully convinced of his prophethood. So they must have a legitimate reason for rejecting that. And if they intentionally reject a messenger of God about whom they think that he is an absolutely true messenger, he's not an impostor, then in spite of these three conditions being met, it will not be no good for them, because now they would be guilty of denying or truth which they had believed. So the belief in prophets is implicitly understood, which means that these three standards are standards which are given by a prophet through the book that he was given by the Almighty. Remember, these three standards are not just revealed out of the air. I mean, they're not standing outside anything. They are contained in a book, and the book was revealed to someone, which obviously means that this message is from some person, and that person, you have to have a legitimate excuse to deny that person. I mean, this something has to come up in your mind, and you say that, well, I accept the Quran, but I think that as far as the person who gave the Quran, I don't believe in him for such and such a reason. Then that reason has to be justified before God. Otherwise, there has to be some justification that why is it that you believe in the message of the person that you actually think is not worthy of being believed in. So this.
But what, Dr. What if you are believing in the message that is already ingrained in you? You recognize the unity of God. You recognize that you are going to be held accountable. This is something which is imbued in us.
Right. So you see, what has happened here is that as people who are seekers of the truth, all of us have been given this obligation to search for the truth. Now, when a person opens his eyes in this world and he seeks the truth, the single claim that comes to him is that there is this last book of God, which is preserved in its original form and revealed to a final prophet. And there is one group of people in the whole wide world who claims that they have the last message of God contained in a book revealed to a prophet from which they follow. So a person has to objectively at least examine this claim. He may reject it, but considering the fact that he says that, oh, all that I'm going to do is follow good deeds, do good deeds, and think that there's going to be an accountability in the hereafter on the basis of these deeds, and also believe in God. So this is something which is already there in his own intuition, I would say. But something additional is found as soon as he becomes a seeker of the truth in the society around him. So as soon as he opens his eyes around the society, if he's a person who's a caring person who would like to find out the truth, he immediately finds that there are some people called Muslims who believe that they have the final message of God. So he should at least be careful enough and more cautious enough to hear them out, what they say, what claim they make, and he may ultimately reject that claim. But being careless towards that claim or not even giving it importance is something that is against that obligation of searching for the truth. So remember, it is a search for the truth for which all of us are obligated. And if this search tells us, I mean, and that is why we see in the Quran, in fact, in the way that the institution of prophet was terminated 14 centuries ago, that this was the time when the message of the Quran has reached most parts of the world, or would potentially reach. So, but later on, even if there could be people to whom the message does not reach it in its proper form, or reaches it in distorted form, or Muslims themselves become a hindrance in accepting faith for such people. So these are excuses that can be afforded to people. Otherwise, the quest for the truth is something that when we put it on in our own selves, we follow that quest, then we have to have some reason for not accepting a prophet of God. If we have that reason and we are convinced of that reason and we can justify that reason before God, then obviously I think that we will be given that concession. But if you have not even embarked on the journey that there is a person who claims to be a final prophet of God who has the final guidance, because this is something which now is part of the intellectual heritage of this world, then it would only mean that we have not, either been serious in evaluating this claim, or we have just passed through it. So there has to be some stance that we have to adopt regarding this. And that would be something that would actually reflect on our fate in the hereafter.
Any on Isa, please go ahead.
Thank you. So I just want to follow up on a question that was asked about Ruhul Amin. And you mentioned that that's Jibreel. But I mean, when I read the works of, for example, Dr. Fazlur Rahman, he has a very different take on Ruhul Amin. So is there like a breadth of opinion here which is acceptable, or how do you think about it?
I think if you read all the verses of the Quran which mentions a Ruhul Amin, you'll find out that I mean, it's hard to say that anything but Gabriel is implied by this word. I mean, if you read the initial verses of Surah Najm, which tell us that how Gabriel came close to the Prophet, فَكَانَ قَابَ قَوْسَيْنِ أَوْ أَدْنَى فَأَوْحَى إِلَىٰ عَبْدِهِ مَا أَوْحَى. He whispered in the heart of the Prophet, or he blew in the heart of the Prophet. And then other verses of the Quran say that Nazala bihi Ruhul Amin, that it is brought down by Ruhul Amin on the heart of the Prophet. And still other verses would talk about Gabriel revealing the Quran. In Surah Baqarah, it says, Nazzalahu ala kalbika. He revealed the Quran to your heart. And Gabriel is mentioned by name. So there are so many instances and cross-referencing in these verses that if you, in fact, the verse which in Surah Baqarah says, "Kul man kana aduwwan li Jibril fa innahu nazzalahu ala qalbika." So the words are that he who is an enemy of Gabriel should tell us, should speak up, because he is the person who has brought it down on your own soul, qalbika, and on your heart actually. And then another verse in I think it is in Surah Shura, it says, "Nazala bihi Ruhul Amin," that the Quran has been brought down by Ruhul Amin. So in one verse, the word Ruhul Amin is used for bringing down the Quran, and parallel to that, Surah Baqarah says Gabriel has brought down the Quran to his heart. So both are speaking of someone bringing down the Quran to the heart of the Prophet. In one verse, Ruhul Amin is used, and the other verse, Gabriel is used, which would just mean that these are synonyms are used interchangeably. And not only here, but there are other verses as well. So I think the verdict of the Quran itself is so clear in this regard that it's hard to have any other opinion.
And your reading would be that when it's brought to the heart of the Prophet, it's brought to his heart in Arabic language.
This is something of a, I mean, we don't have any understanding. It's like saying that it is revealed to the mind of the Prophet. I mean, in the Quran, the heart is basically the center of the soul. It's like the center of your awareness, the seat of your awareness. So it's like a metaphor for your conscious self. So all that it means is that the angel Gabriel or Ruhul Amin has brought it down to the Prophet, and the Prophet then disseminates it to his companions. So the word heart is just used as a seat of consciousness where he receives the Quran and then, of course, stores it in his mind, memorizes it, and then disseminates it. So it's just a seat of consciousness for the soul, the way the word heart has been used in the Quran.
So our last question is from Danish. Danish, please unmute your mic and go ahead.
My question is related to the lecture earlier regarding the verse, "Give full measure when you measure and weigh with correct scales." So when it comes to trade, this is pretty straightforward. But my question is around the services industry, specifically take like software engineering, for example, right? In this field, so there are a couple of nuances. The employers don't always pay overtime. And it's not, it's partially an art and partially science. So people can have different levels of skill. For the same amount of work required, one person can clock in 9 to 5, work 30 days a month, and produce the same output as another person who's more skilled and gets the same result in a day. So my question is, from the perspective of this verse, is the contract fulfilled if, person A who takes 30 days versus person B who takes 1 day? Is it considered the same for both of them, given that the output is the same? Yeah, that's basically what I'm trying to understand.
I think this verse specifically deals with honesty in giving out your merchandise. But what you're talking about is actually mentioned elsewhere in the Quran. In fact, this very passage says, "Awfu bil ahd," that you fulfill your agreement and your word with the other people, because these agreements are going to be questioned. I think this comes more into the ambit of this, that whatever the agreement you've made between an employee and an employer, it has to be honored. And it's a promise, it's like a contract which has been made between the two. So I would say that this comes more into more under that part of the verse. This particular verse, because you see, the Arabs were tradesmen, they were business people, and they had a lot of evils, and they had the people of Shuaib a couple of centuries before them, who were guilty of not weighing and measuring correctly. So these are the things that the Quran wanted to point out, that they should not be plagued by these. And it's not just here. You'll find measuring and weighing to be done correctly is mentioned elsewhere in the Quran as well, to emphasize the fact that when you are in the market, when you are you are a tradesman or you are a businessman, then this is a primary virtue that must be fulfilled. But fulfilling the contract which is between an employee and an employer, whether it's regarding overtime, whether it's regarding salary, whether it's regarding the number of hours put in. So all these are contractual obligations that are penned down in a contract, and they have to be abided by. And if there is a violation, then it would be a violation of that contract.
Got it. Just one follow-up question. So one sort of common problem in my field is employers have this sort of bait and switch tactic. So they will bring you in on a contract, not contract in the sense of like an agreement for a term appointed, but more in terms of the job descriptions. They will make a very rosy job description, and then when you actually like start working for them, it turns out to be something else. In other words, the contract gets changed all the time. What is the Islamic view on such a situation? Like, I'm trying to understand how contracts or how oaths work, right? Like, my understanding is they have to be, it's a two-way agreement, right? So party A says XYZ, party B says whatever, and they both agree on a set of terms. Like one of the parties breaks the agreement, and often it's done in a very sort of how can I say this, a very planned way. Because a lot of people work on a visa and have various other sort of limitations, right? So it's not easy for them to move from company A to company B. They're basically stuck there for a number of months or years. So what's the...
As I said earlier on, if any violation of the contract takes place from either side, then this is a grave, it's a serious offense. And in many countries, it can be challenged in the courts of law. I'm not saying in our country, like the country of Pakistan, this is not a very good practice that you go to courts to settle this thing. But many contracts are protected by law all over the world. So if there is any violation, if there is anything in which they show a rosy picture, and then when the actual time of the job comes and it turns out to be an entirely different thing or scenario, then in most parts of the world, in most countries of the world, you can have yourself protected by law and tell them that this is how the contract was made, and now a violation is being committed. So I think it's just a simple case of violation being committed and being challenged in a court of law wherever it's possible.
Yeah, in the US, for example, it's basically not possible to challenge the employer because of resources required for lawyers and various other complications. But my question was more around the status of the contract itself. If one party violates the contract, does the contract still remain in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? What is the status of that contract, right? That's what I'm more interested in. Yeah.
Actually, if one of the parties violates it, then of course it's a question of violation. I mean, the other party is abiding by it, one of the parties is violating it, which means actually that for all intents and purposes, it has declared it as null and void. It's not no longer abiding by it. So it's like a cancelled contract. So they have gone back on their word. So in the eyes of God, the contract is still there, but the party who has violated that contract shall be, chastised in the eyes of God. Whenever, either through it should of course take place in a court of law wherever it's possible. If it's not possible in one country, then there are several other instances in which this can be done. But other than that, if, for example, if this could not be done anywhere, still this would be a crime in the eyes of God. And once a person returns to God, he's going to be taken to task for this.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
So this was the last question of the session. So thank you all the participants for joining us today and for your valuable questions. And Dr. Shehzad, thank you so much for your valuable time and teachings. And we look forward to seeing you next weekend with another program. Till then, I say Khuda Hafiz from all of us and have a good one.